The dust of Dust Hollow settled on everything, a fine, pale grit that coated the soul as much as the tongue. Coulter Hayes felt it in his teeth as he rode his weary buckskin down the town's only street. It was less a street and more a scar carved between two rows of false-fronted buildings, all of them hunched against a wind that never seemed to stop blowing from the jagged peaks to the west. He had been riding for a month, chasing the ghost of a man named Silas Croft, a low-life smuggler whose name had been whispered in connection with a string of missing girls from settlements farther north. The trail had led him here, to this place that God had seemingly scoured clean of anything gentle. Coulter's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, took in the town's bones. The saloon, weathered and listing to one side, faced off against a stark white church whose steeple clawed at the heavens like a desperate prayer. Between them stood the general store, the sheriff's office, a livery, and a handful of small, severe-looking houses. There were no bright colors, no laughter carried on the wind, only the creak of a sign and the wary eyes of the few people who scurried from one doorway to the next. They moved with their heads down, their shoulders drawn in, as if expecting a blow from the sky itself. He could feel the town's pulse, slow and rigid, governed by the cold shadow of that church. It was a place wrapped in a thick cloak of righteousness. But Coulter had been in enough towns like this to know that such cloaks were often used to hide the deepest stains. Hypocrisy had a particular smell, like wet rot in old wood, and he could smell it thick in the air of Dust Hollow. He swung down from his horse in front of the livery, his joints aching with a familiar fire. The hostler who took his reins was a stooped man with a furtive glance, who said nothing more than what was required. Coulter paid him for a week's board for the horse, and in return, received only a grunt and a nod. The entire town felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the church, Mercy Blake polished the silver communion cup until her own face, pale and serious, stared back at her. The scent of beeswax and old paper filled the kitchen, a scent she had known her entire life. At 20, her world was defined by the four walls of the parsonage and the church to which it was attached. She was Preacher Blake's daughter, a title that was both a shield and a cage. The townspeople spoke of her in hushed, approving tones, so gentle, so obedient, a model of feminine purity. They did not see the calluses on her hands from scrubbing floors and kneading dough, nor did they hear the silent scream of her spirit against the crushing weight of her father's expectations. Her father, the Reverend Thaddeus Blake, was a man carved from granite. His love was a conditional thing, a reward for perfect compliance. His sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, warnings against the temptations of the flesh and the wickedness of the world. Mercy had learned early that to be loved was to be silent, to be still, to erase the parts of herself that might be deemed improper. So she helped run the church kitchen, organized the sewing circles, and smiled her quiet, gentle smile, all under his constant, watchful gaze. But late at night, in the dark of her small room, she would lie awake and wonder if there was a world beyond the one her father described, a world where a woman's goodness was not measured by her ability to disappear. Her chores done, her father gave her a small coin and a list of supplies. "Go straight to the store, Mercy, and come straight back. Do not dally. The world is full of snares for the unwary." She nodded, her voice a soft murmur. "Yes, Father." The bell above the door of Henderson's general store announced her arrival with a cheerful jingle that was immediately swallowed by the store's dense silence. It was there she saw him for the first time. He was standing at the far end of the counter, his back to her, a tall figure in dusty, travel-worn clothes. He turned as the bell rang, and Mercy's breath caught in her throat. He was not handsome in the way the town's few eligible young men were. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, his jaw tight, his mouth a straight, unsmiling line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, troubled gray, and they seemed to see right through the carefully constructed facade of the preacher's daughter to the restless soul beneath. She quickly lowered her own gaze, a flush creeping up her neck. It was improper to stare. Coulter watched her approach the counter, her movements graceful and contained. She was beautiful, with hair the color of spun corn silk pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the blue of a summer sky. But there was a fragility about her, a tension in the way she held her shoulders, that spoke of a bird with clipped wings. He saw the slight tremor in her hands as she passed her list to Mr. Henderson. "Flour, sugar, salt pork," the portly storekeeper read aloud, his voice booming in the quiet. "For the Reverend, I presume?" "Yes, sir," Mercy whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the countertop. Coulter had finished his own small purchase, a bag of coffee and some jerky, but he did not leave. He found himself lingering, watching the subtle play of emotion on her face. When Mr. Henderson placed a heavy sack of flour on the counter, Mercy reached for it, but her small frame was not suited for the weight. Before he knew what he was doing, Coulter stepped forward. "Allow me," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Mercy startled, her head snapping up. She was even closer now, close enough to see the fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes, close enough to see the faded white scars that crisscrossed the knuckles of his hands. They were not the hands of a farmer or a rancher. They were the hands of a man who had seen his share of violence. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. He lifted the heavy sack with an ease that made her stomach flutter and set it near her feet. For a moment, his scarred hand brushed against her sleeve, and a jolt, like lightning, shot through her. Their eyes met again, and this time, the connection was undeniable. It was a silent, startling recognition, not a familiarity, but of a shared, unspoken sorrow. He saw the cage she was in, and she saw the wilderness he carried inside him. The moment was broken by Mr. Henderson clearing his throat. "That'll be all. Miss Blake?" Mercy tore her gaze away, her face burning. She paid for her things, gathered her smaller parcels, and practically fled from the store, leaving Coulter to carry the sack of flour for her. He followed her out and set it on the porch of the parsonage without a word. She did not look at him again, but she felt his solemn eyes on her back as she disappeared inside, the heavy wooden door closing with a final, echoing thud. That night, Coulter sat in the corner of the saloon, nursing a single glass of whiskey and listening. The talk was of weather and cattle prices, but underneath it ran a current of fear and resentment. He watched Sheriff Brody, a man with a fleshy face and a lazy gut, drink for free and laugh too loudly with a pair of rough-looking ranchers. Coulter knew the type, a man who wore a badge not to uphold the law, but to profit from its absence. He left before the whiskey could dull his senses and walked the dark, muddy alley behind the saloon. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. It was then that he heard it, a choked cry, followed by the sound of a slap and a man's guttural laugh. "You'll take what we give you, girl," a voice slurred. Coulter's entire body went cold and still. He moved toward the sound, his steps silent in the mud, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife sheathed at his belt. He rounded the corner of a rain barrel and saw them. Two men had a woman pinned against the rough plank wall. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her face streaked with tears and dirt. He did not shout. He did not issue a warning. He simply moved. The first man heard him a second too late. Coulter's fist connected with his jaw with a sickening crack, and the man crumpled to the ground. The second one turned, his eyes wide with drunken surprise, and reached for a pistol at his hip. He was too slow. Coulter disarmed him with a brutal twist of his wrist and sent him sprawling into the mud with a kick to the chest. The woman, free from their grasp, slid down the wall, sobbing. Coulter stood over the two groaning men, his breathing even, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get out of here," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And if I ever see you lay a hand on her, or any other woman in this town, I will finish what I started." The men scrambled to their feet and stumbled away into the darkness, casting terrified glances over their shoulders. from her bedroom window in the parsonage. Mercy Blake had been drawn by the shouting. She saw the shadows moving in the alley, the flash of violence, and then the still figure of the man from the store standing over the injured woman. The sheriff arrived a few moments later. Drawn by the commotion, Mercy watched, her heart pounding, as Sheriff Brody took one look at the weeping woman. A known prostitute named Clara glanced at Coulter and then simply shrugged. "Just saloon trash settling a dispute," the sheriff said with a dismissive wave. "Move along now. Nothing to see here." He turned and walked away, leaving the woman to her fate. But the stranger did not walk away. Mercy watched, transfixed, as he knelt beside Clara. He spoke to her in a low voice she could not hear. And then he did something no other man in Dust Hollow would ever do. He gently gathered the fallen woman into his arms, as if she were something precious, and carried her down the street toward the small cabin where Doc Miller lived. The sight burned itself into Mercy's mind. In a town that preached piety and practiced cruelty, this grim, silent stranger had shown a kindness so profound it shook the foundations of her world. He was not like the other men. He was nothing like them at all. Later, alone in the cheap room he had rented, Coulter stared at his own reflection in the cracked mirror. The face looking back was a stranger's, haggard and worn. The incident in the alley had stirred the ghosts he kept locked away. He closed his eyes, and the memory rose, sharp and suffocating, as it always did. He was 17 again. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning pine. Raiders had swept down on their small, isolated homestead just after dusk. He remembered the chaos, the gunshots, the screams of his mother. He had been trying to get the horses out of the barn when they dragged his sister, Lily, from the house. She was only 14, with hair as bright as a poppy and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. Her eyes, wide with terror, had found his across the yard. "Coulter!" she had screamed, her voice breaking. He had started to run toward her, armed with nothing but a pitchfork and a boy's desperate courage. But his father's arm, strong as iron, had clamped around his chest, holding him back. "No, son! They'll kill you! We can't lose you both!" He had struggled, a wild, useless animal caught in a trap, and had been forced to watch as they threw Lily over the front of a saddle and rode away into the night. Her cry had echoed in his ears long after they were gone. They had never seen her again. His father had withered from the grief, dying 2 years later. His mother had simply faded, a ghost in her own home. But Coulter had been forged in the fire of that failure. The guilt was a stone in his gut, a constant, heavy presence. He had failed to save his sister, so he had made a vow, a silent, bloody promise to the memory of her scream. He would spend his life saving others. He would ride into the dark places. He would face the evil that preyed on the vulnerable, and he would not fail again. The next morning, the air in the parsonage was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the coming storm. Mercy was dusting the books in her father's study when Sheriff Brody arrived. She retreated to the hallway, but she could hear their low, rumbling voices through the half-closed door. "She was seen talking to a ranch hand down by the creek," the sheriff said. "Alone." "The Lord's rules are clear." Her father's voice was cold as a winter river. "A disobedient girl invites ruin upon herself and her family. She brings shame to this community." "What do you want me to do, Reverend?" There was a long pause. When her father spoke again, his voice was laced with a chilling certainty. "Sometimes, a lamb must be shown the wolf to appreciate the safety of the fold. We must be prepared to deliver harsh punishment to those who disobey the church's rules, to make an example of them, so others do not stray." Mercy felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She thought of Sarah Miller, a girl from town who had been caught kissing a boy and had been sent away to live with family back east a few months ago. No one had heard from her since. She thought of other girls who had laughed too loudly or questioned the church's teachings, who had simply vanished. Her father and the sheriff were not talking about saving souls. They were talking about control, about a punishment that was far darker than a public shaming. Later that afternoon, she was hanging laundry in the churchyard when she saw him. Coulter Hayes was leaving the livery, his stride long and purposeful. He stopped in the middle of the street, as if he felt her gaze, and slowly turned his head. His eyes found hers across the expanse of dusty ground, across the picket fence that separated the holy ground of the church from the sullied ground of the town. This time, there was no surprise in their locked gaze. There was no fleeting curiosity. Mercy saw the storm in his eyes and knew he had seen the town's rotten core. And in her eyes, Coulter saw not the obedient preacher's daughter, but a terrified young woman standing on the edge of a precipice. It was a look that passed between two people who recognized, with a sudden and terrible clarity, that they were standing on the same side of a secret war. That night, the church was colder than a tomb. Mercy knelt on the hard wooden floor of the sanctuary, the moonlight through the tall, arched windows laying down pale stripes across the pews. She was supposed to be praying for forgiveness, for a pure heart, for the strength to be the daughter her father and the town expected her to be. But the words that rose in her soul were not the ones from the good book. They were jagged and sharp, a heresy of her own making. "Lord," she whispered into the echoing silence. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "I am tired. I am so tired of being good." The admission felt like a crack forming in a sheet of ice. "My whole life, I have tried to be what they want. Quiet, obedient, a vessel for your word, as Father says. But their goodness feels like a stone. It is a weight they use to hold me down, to keep me small. It is a weapon they use to judge and to punish. If this is goodness, then I do not want it. Forgive me," she added, the words a hollow echo of habit. "But I don't think I mean it." She stayed there for a long time, not in prayer, but in a state of still, silent rebellion. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time, it was joined by a spark of something else, a dangerous, thrilling resolve. While Mercy wrestled with her faith, Coulter Hayes was engaged in a different kind of devotion. His church was the town's shadows, his scripture the whispered fears of its overlooked citizens. He began his work quietly, methodically. He spent time at the livery, helping the hostler with the horses, listening more than he spoke. He learned which ranchers were struggling, which men drank too much, and which ones held secret meetings with Sheriff Brody. He spent his coin at the general store, buying small things he didn't need, just to observe the flow of people, to catch snippets of gossip that might hold a kernel of truth. He asked about families who had moved away, his questions casual, couched in the guise of a man looking for work. "Heard the Miller family packed up sudden a few months back," he'd say. "Wonder what spooked them?" The answers were always vague, laced with a pious disapproval. Their girl Sarah was getting a bit wild. "Mister," Henderson would reply, lowering his voice. Best she was sent away before she brought real trouble. Sent away. It was always the same phrase. Coulter started a list in his mind, a grim tally of the girls who had been sent away over the past year. Sarah Miller, Elizabeth Finch, Martha Gable. Young women who had been deemed too loud, too curious, too alive. He cross-referenced the names with the town's land registry, a dusty ledger in a back room of the sheriff's office that Brody let him look at for a fee. Believing Coulter was a prospective buyer, he found a pattern. Shortly after each girl's departure, a small sum of money was deposited into the church's account, noted as an anonymous tithe, and an even larger, untraceable cash withdrawal was made by Sheriff Brody from the town's funds, marked for traveling expenses. The connection was thin, circumstantial, but Coulter's gut told him it was there. The preacher and the sheriff, the cross and the badge. The two pillars of Dust Hollow were rotten to the core, and he suspected they were using the town's rigid morality as a cover, a way to identify and isolate vulnerable girls, marking them as fallen before selling them into the very darkness the Reverend Blake preached against. The storm that had been brewing in Mercy's soul finally broke on a Tuesday. The day began with the arrival of Mr. Abernathy, the town banker. He was a man in his late 50s, with a soft, doughy body and small, wet eyes that lingered on Mercy a moment too long. Her father had invited him for lunch, an unusual honor, and the reason became clear as they sat around the polished dining table. Mr. Abernathy has expressed an interest in taking a wife, the Reverend Blake announced, his voice leaving no room for discussion. He is a pillar of this community, a God-fearing man of considerable means. He has asked for your hand. Mercy, we have accepted on your behalf. Mercy's fork clattered against her plate. She looked from her father's unyielding face to Mr. Abernathy's smug smile. He was old enough to be her grandfather. The thought of his soft hands on her, his wet eyes watching her in the dark, sent a wave of nausea through her. Father, You will be a dutiful wife. Her father cut her off, his eyes flashing a warning. You will honor him and obey him, as is your sacred duty. No, Mercy said. The word was a whisper, but it landed in the room with the force of a gunshot. Mr. Abernathy's smile faltered. The Reverend's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. What did you say? I said no, Mercy repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I will not marry him. Her father rose slowly from his chair, his shadow falling over her. You are entertaining improper thoughts. Daughter, I have seen it in your eyes. That stranger in town, the one with the devil's own look about him, you have been watching him. Has he poisoned your mind with worldly ideas? This has nothing to do with him, she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. I simply do not wish to marry Mr. Abernathy. Your wishes are irrelevant, her father hissed. They are the foolish whims of a girl who does not know what is good for her. You will marry him, or you will be disciplined. When she still refused, her face pale but her chin set, he grabbed her arm. His fingers were like steel bands. He dragged her from the room, past a stunned Mr. Abernathy, and down the narrow hallway to the cellar door. He unlocked it with a key from his pocket and thrust her into the damp, musty darkness. You will remain here until you have purged these sinful, disobedient thoughts from your heart, he declared, his voice booming in the enclosed space. You will pray for humility, and you will reconsider your answer. The heavy door slammed shut, and the bolt slid home. Mercy was plunged into a blackness so complete it felt like she was being buried alive. She was left alone with the smell of damp earth, the scuttling of unseen things, and the terrifying echo of her own defiance. Coulter saw her the next morning. He had been watching the parsonage, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He'd seen the banker leave the day before, his face flushed with anger. He'd seen the Reverend emerge this morning alone, his expression grimmer than usual, but he had not seen Mercy. He found her by the water pump in the churchyard, her back to him. She moved slowly, stiffly, as if her bones ached. When she turned, her face was so pale it looked translucent, with dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. She was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. He walked toward her, his spurs silent in the soft dirt. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He took the bucket from her nerveless fingers, filled it, and then, using the tin dipper that hung from the pump, he held it out to her. Her eyes, wide and haunted, met his. She took the dipper, her hands shaking so much that water sloshed over the sides. He saw the raw, red marks on her wrists, just peeking out from the cuffs of her sleeves, where she must have struggled or been held. He said nothing about them. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He knew what kind of piety left marks like that. But she saw the fury in his eyes. It was a cold, quiet fire, a terrifying stillness that was more menacing than any shout. It was an anger that was entirely on her behalf. And in that moment, she felt more protected by this dangerous stranger than she had ever felt in her father's house. She drank the water, the cold liquid a balm to her raw throat, and handed the dipper back. Their fingers brushed, and this time the spark was one of shared alliance, a silent promise against a common enemy. Later that day, Coulter went to see Clara. Doc Miller let him in, nodding toward the small cot where she was resting. She was still bruised, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a wary resilience. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said, her voice raspy. "No one deserves that," Coulter answered, his voice gentle. He sat with her for a while, talking about nothing of consequence, letting her grow comfortable with his presence. Finally, he leaned forward. "Clara, I need your help. There are girls disappearing from this town." A flicker of fear returned to her eyes. She looked away. "We don't talk about that. It's bad luck." "I'm not looking for luck," Coulter said. "I'm looking for a man named Silas Croft, and I'm looking for the men in this town who are helping him. Men like the sheriff." Clara was silent for a long time. "You can't fight them," she whispered. "They're too powerful. The Reverend, he points the finger, and the sheriff, he does the rest." "What does he do?" Coulter pressed softly. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark with a secret she had carried for too long. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely audible, "a wagon comes at midnight. No lights. It waits out on the old East Road, by the dead oak. A girl is brought out, one who's made some trouble, and she gets on that wagon, and she's never seen again. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. We all know about the wagon. We just pretend we don't. The wagon at midnight." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The girls weren't just being sent away. They were being sold. That evening, driven by a restlessness he couldn't contain, Coulter rode his buckskin out to the edge of town, to the low ridge that overlooked the entire valley. He needed the open space, the vast, empty sky, to clear his head. He was so focused on the dark grid of the town below that he didn't hear her approach until she was almost upon him. "You're going to get yourself killed." He turned. It was Mercy, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the evening chill. She had followed him. It was the boldest, most reckless thing she had ever done. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'm asking you the same thing," she countered, her fear making her brave. "You are looking for something? In the saloon, at the store. I've seen you, watching everyone. What is it you want in Dust Hollow?" She took a step closer, her blue eyes searching his face in the fading light. "Last night, in the alley, you helped that woman, and today, you knew something had happened to me. I want the truth. Who are you?" He looked at her for a long time, at the desperate courage in her face, at the bruises on her soul that matched the ones on her wrists. He had spent years building walls around his heart, letting no one in, but looking at Mercy Blake. He felt one of those walls begin to crumble. He owed her the truth. He told her everything. He told her about his sister, Lily, his voice low and strained, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He told her about the raid, about the vow he had made, about the other girls he had saved and the ones he had been too late for. He told her about the trafficking ring he had been tracking, and how the trail had led him here, to her town, to her father, to her sheriff. As he spoke, he saw the dawning horror and understanding in her eyes. The vague fears she had harbored now had a name. The whispers and disappearances now had a terrible, logical explanation. He finished his story, and the silence that fell between them was heavy with the weight of it all. His gaze fell to her hands, which she was clutching in front of her. The cuffs of her dress had ridden up slightly, fully revealing the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. "Your father did that to you," he said. It was not a question. She flinched and tried to pull her sleeves down, a gesture of ingrained shame. He didn't touch her. He kept his hands at his sides, though it took every ounce of his willpower not to reach for her, not to smooth away the pain he saw in her face. His own guilt was a living thing, clawing at him. He had failed to save Lily. Was he going to fail this girl too? "Do you want out, Mercy?" he asked, his voice quiet but intense. "I can get you out of here. Tonight, I can take you somewhere safe, far away from all this." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. She looked back at the town, at the distant, accusing steeple of her father's church. It was all she had ever known. The thought of leaving it was as terrifying as the thought of staying. I don't know," she whispered, the words torn from her. "I don't know who I would be if I wasn't his daughter, if I wasn't good." The storm finally broke late that night, a furious squall that threw sheets of rain against the window panes and rattled the very foundations of the buildings. Coulter was sitting by the small fire in his rented room, cleaning his pistol, when he heard a frantic pounding on his door. He opened it to find Mercy standing on the threshold, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face, shivering violently. She looked wild, undone, a different person from the composed girl who served meals in the church kitchen. "Mercy, what is it? What's wrong?" She stared at him, her eyes blazing with a desperate, feverish light. She took a staggering step forward, crossing the threshold into the warmth of his room. The words came out in a raw, broken whisper, a final, defiant cry against a lifetime of silence. "I don't want to be a good girl tonight," she whispered. And then the cowboy shut the door, closing out the storm and the whole wicked world behind it. He reached for her, but not with lust. He took her trembling frame and held her gently, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket from his bedroll. The firelight danced in her eyes, reflecting the inferno of emotion that burned between them, a dangerous heat of shared pain and forbidden desire. She looked up at him, expecting him to kiss her, expecting him to take the broken pieces she was offering. But he just held her steady, his scarred hands firm on her shoulders, his gaze unwavering. "Not like this," he said, his voice a low rumble, full of a tenderness she had never known. "Not when you're running from them. Not until you know who you are, outside of their rules and their church and their cages. Not until you're choosing, for yourself, what you want." He held her until her shivering stopped, offering a sanctuary that demanded nothing in return. The heat from the fire, a silent promise of the passion that would wait until her soul was truly her own. The dawn that followed the storm was quiet and clean, the air washed of dust, in the small, borrowed room. Mercy woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. She was wrapped in Coulter's blanket. Her damp clothes hung carefully by the fire to dry. He sat in the single chair, watching her, his face unreadable in the gray morning light. The memory of her desperate plea on his doorstep made her cheeks burn with shame. But he offered no judgment, only a tin cup of hot coffee. "You cannot go back there," he said, his voice flat and final. "I have nowhere else to go," she answered, her own voice small. "Anywhere is better than there," he countered. "We ride out today. I'll take you to the next territory. Find you a safe place." A week ago, she would have clung to that offer like a lifeline. But the girl who had been locked in the cellar was not the same one who had run through the storm. "No," she said, the word stronger this time. "Running is what he expects. It is what they do to all the girls they cannot control. They chase them out, or they make them disappear. I will not be another ghost in this town's story." Coulter studied her, seeing the fragile shoot of defiance pushing its way through the hard soil of her fear. He had planned to get her to safety, to fulfill his vow by delivering her from harm and then riding on, alone as always. But her refusal complicated things, stirring a reluctant admiration in him. "If you stay, you have to be able to fight," he said. "They will not stop coming for you. Your father, the sheriff, they see you as a loose thread that can unravel everything." And so her training began. He did not coddle her. In the hidden hollow behind the livery stables, he taught her the brutal realities of survival. He started with a knife. He placed his own Bowie knife in her hand. It was heavy, cold, and wickedly sharp. Her fingers, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, felt clumsy and foreign wrapped around the leather hilt. "It is not a tool for sewing," he told her, his voice devoid of emotion as he showed her how to hold it, how to angle her body, where to strike. "You do not slash. You push. Aim for the soft places, under the ribs, the throat. Do not hesitate. Hesitation is how you die." She flinched at his words, but she did as he said, practicing the motions against a burlap sack stuffed with straw until her arms ached and her palms were raw. He taught her to ride his buckskin, not with the gentle posture of a lady, but leaning low over the horse's neck, becoming one with its power and speed. He took her out into the scrubland beyond the town, unrolling a worn map and teaching her how to read the contours of the land, how to find water, how to navigate by the stars. He was a harsh teacher, demanding and relentless, because he knew that a single mistake could be her last. But as he trained her body, something else was happening. He was giving her back her own strength, a power she never knew she possessed. And Mercy, in turn, began to see the man behind the stoic mask. She saw the patience in his hands as he adjusted her grip on the reins, the flicker of sorrow in his eyes when he spoke of finding shelter, a sorrow that told her he had failed to find it for someone else long ago. His plan was still to take her away, but he agreed to wait, to gather more proof. Mercy, however, had a different idea of how to use that time. She started visiting Clara at the doctor's cabin, at first bringing food from the church kitchens, an act of charity her father could not fault. But soon, her visits became something more. Clara, seeing the change in the preacher's daughter, slowly began to trust her. She introduced Mercy to the other women who lived in the shadows of Dust Hollow, the ones the town deemed soiled, in a small, hidden room behind the saloon. Mercy saw the truth of her father's righteousness. She saw women with bruised faces and broken spirits, women who had been used and discarded by the very men who sat in the front pews on Sunday morning. Her hands, now calloused from knife practice, learned to be gentle again. She cleaned wounds, she stitched cuts, she listened. She heard stories of desperation, of cruelty, and of a profound, lonely courage. She learned that these fallen women were not sinners to be condemned, but survivors. Her father had preached that purity was a woman's shield, a holy armor that would protect her from the evils of the world. But looking at the pain in that room, Mercy realized with a sickening clarity that her purity had never protected anyone. It had only been a measure of her obedience, a gilded cage to keep her from seeing the truth. Goodness, she was learning, had nothing to do with being untouched. It had to do with touching the wounds of others without flinching. The news that the preacher's daughter was spending her time with the town's outcasts did not go unnoticed. One evening, as Mercy was leaving Clara, Sheriff Brody and two of his thuggish deputies cornered her in the alley. "Evening, Miss Blake," the sheriff said, his voice slick with false concern. "Your father is worried sick about you. Says you've been taken in by this devil of a stranger, that he's kidnapped you and filled your head with lies." "I have not been kidnapped," Mercy said, her voice steady, her hand resting on the small knife Coulter had given her, now hidden in the folds of her skirt. "That is for us to decide," Brody sneered. "You will come with us. We will take you back to your father for purification." Before they could lay a hand on her, Coulter was there. He seemed to materialize from the deepest shadows, moving with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. He did not draw his gun. He did not need to. He disarmed the first deputy with a swift, brutal movement, sending the man's pistol skittering into the mud. The second deputy lunged, and Coulter met him with an elbow to the throat that sent him gasping to his knees. Sheriff Brody, his face pale with shock and rage, drew his own weapon. "Hayes, you're under arrest for kidnapping and assault." "You will not touch her," Coulter said, his voice a low growl. He stood between Mercy and the sheriff, a human shield. The standoff was broken by Clara, who threw open the back door of the saloon. "Go, now!" she hissed. Coulter grabbed Mercy's hand, and they ran. Clara followed close behind, her face grim. They fled through the back alleys, Coulter leading them on a twisting path to the livery. He saddled his buckskin in a blur of motion, throwing Mercy up behind the saddle and pulling Clara up onto the horse of a sleeping rancher. "We have to get to the mountains," he said, his voice tight. "They will be watching the main roads." They rode out of town under the cover of a moonless sky, the sound of the sheriff's angry shouts fading behind them. They rode for hours, pushing the horses hard, climbing into the high country where the air grew thin and cold. They finally took shelter in an abandoned mining shack, a ramshackle structure clinging precariously to the side of a steep canyon. It was little more than a single room with a rusty stove and a few broken cots. But it was cover, and it was far from Dust Hollow. The days that followed were a strange mixture of tension and peace. The vast, silent wilderness was a world away from the suffocating judgment of the town. The isolation stripped away the last of their masks. There was no preacher's daughter, no haunted avenger, no soiled woman. There were only three people bound together by a shared danger. One evening, as Clara slept soundly on a cot, Mercy and Coulter sat by the small, crackling fire. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. She had watched him for days, had seen the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the way he never truly rested, the guilt he carried like a shroud. She saw the profound loneliness in him, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. He flinched at the contact, his muscles tensing. "You blame yourself," she said softly, "for your sister." He did not answer, but his jaw tightened. "It was not your fault, Coulter," she whispered. "You were just a boy." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the 17-year-old boy who had been forced to watch his world shatter. "I should have saved her." "You are saving me," she said. And then she leaned in and kissed him. It was not a desperate, frantic kiss like the one she had imagined in the storm. It was slow and hesitant, and full of a question she was finally brave enough to ask. For a moment, he remained rigid, his body a wall of resistance, and then, with a low groan that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul, the wall crumbled. He kissed her back. This time, he did not hold back. His arms went around her, pulling her close, his mouth claiming hers with a raw, desperate hunger that spoke of years of solitude and suppressed longing. It was a kiss of grief and hope, of fire and solace. Their first night together was as slow and tender as the kiss had been. It was an exploration of skin and scars, both visible and invisible, for Mercy. It was a reclamation of her own body, a discovery that it was not a vessel for shame or duty, but a source of pleasure and connection. For Coulter, it was an act of terrifying vulnerability, letting someone pass the defenses he had spent a lifetime building. Every touch was hesitant, every caress a question. They moved together with an emotional honesty that was more profound than any passion, a quiet, desperate breaking of chains for them both. In the heart of the lonely mountains, two broken souls found a fragile, fleeting moment of peace in each other's arms. In the days that followed their night together, a new kind of storm brewed. This one inside Coulter. He had opened his heart, a place he had kept locked and barred for over a decade. The joy he felt when he was with Mercy was terrifying, because with it came the paralyzing fear of loss. He found himself watching her with a painful intensity, the memory of Lily's face superimposed over hers. He had allowed himself to care, and in his world, caring was a vulnerability he could not afford. He grew distant, his words becoming clipped, the walls slowly rising around him once more. He knew they could not run forever. Sooner or later, Brody or Croft or someone else from that poisoned town would find them. Mercy felt him pulling away and knew she was losing him to his ghosts. She had to give him a reason to fight for the future, not just to atone for the past. One morning, as he was cleaning his rifle, she pulled a small, leather-bound book from her satchel. "I found this in my father's study," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The night I ran, I took it." Coulter looked up. It was a journal. He took it from her and opened it. The pages were filled with his elegant, precise script. But the words were not sermons or prayers. They were ledgers, names, dates, and amounts, all recorded with chilling, businesslike detachment. "Sarah Miller," Coulter read aloud, his voice grim. "October 12th, $100, for transgressions of the flesh. Delivered to S.C. "See," Mercy whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Silas Croft." It was all there, a detailed record of the town's conspiracy, a holy man's meticulous accounting of the souls he had sold. It was the proof Coulter had been looking for. It was the weapon they needed to burn Dust Hollow to the ground. A plan formed quickly. "Clara," Coulter said, turning to her, "there is a federal marshal in Redemption, 2 days' ride from here. His name is Elias Thorne. He is the only lawman I trust. You will take this journal and one of the horses. You will ride there and not stop. You will give this only to him." Clara's face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. "I will do it," she said. Coulter gave her the map, showing her the safest route. He gave her his canteen and the last of their food. They watched her ride away until she was just a small speck against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Now, they were truly alone. "When she returns with the marshal, we will go back," Coulter said, his voice regaining its purpose. "We will expose everything." Mercy looked toward the distant valley where Dust Hollow lay hidden. She thought of the faces of the townspeople, the women who had whispered behind their hands about her, the men who had looked at her with pious judgment while harboring their own dark secrets. Just showing them the journal would not be enough. Her father would call her a liar, a harlot, a thief. The town, steeped in his venom for so long, might believe him. "They will not believe a book," she said, her voice filled with a cold certainty. "Not unless I make them. They need to see that I am not afraid of them anymore. They will not believe the truth unless I am willing to walk through the fire to tell it." Coulter looked at her, at the preacher's daughter who had been forged into something wilder and stronger in the mountain crucible. And he knew she was right. They were not just going back to fight. They were going back for a reckoning. 3 days. They had been waiting for 3 days. Holed up in the hayloft of the livery stable. The hostler, a man named Jedediah, whose fear was stronger than his loyalty to the sheriff, had taken Coulter's money and agreed to keep his mouth shut, from a crack in the weathered wood. They could watch the slow, poisonous life of Dust Hollow unfold. They had returned under the cover of a cloudy, moonless night, looking like 1,000 other drifters who haunted the territories. Coulter had traded their horses for a tired-looking mule and a rickety wagon loaded with a few worthless pelts. He wore a floppy, stained hat that shadowed his face, and a cheap poncho that hid the familiar lines of his body. Mercy had performed the greatest transformation. In their mountain hideout, she had taken his knife and sawed off her long, corn-silk hair, leaving it in a ragged, boyish cut that fell just below her ears. Dressed in a pair of old trousers and a canvas shirt he had found, with a bit of dirt smudged on her cheeks, she was unrecognizable as the pristine preacher's daughter. The change was more than skin deep. With every inch of hair that had fallen to the floor, a piece of the old Mercy had fallen with it. They spoke little during their vigil. The waiting was a heavy thing, a physical presence in the small, dusty space. Coulter spent the hours cleaning his weapons, his movements economical and precise, his senses stretched to their limit. He would watch the street, his eyes missing nothing, cataloging the movements of the sheriff and his deputies, noting the townsfolk who scurried to the church and the ones who slunk into the saloon. Mercy watched him, and in his coiled stillness, she saw the terrible cost of the life he had chosen. She felt no fear, only a cold, hard clarity. The girl who had trembled at her own father's voice was gone. In her place was a woman who had looked into the abyss and was now prepared to make the abyss look back. On the morning of the third day, the Sabbath, the church bell began to toll. Its familiar, solemn peal no longer sounded like a call to prayer, but a summons to a final, desperate battle. "It is time," Mercy said, her voice quiet but firm. Coulter looked at her. Her blue eyes, once so easily clouded with uncertainty, were as clear and sharp as ice. He gave a single, curt nod. "I will be in the back, near the west window. If it goes bad, get to that window." She reached out and touched his scarred hand. "Be safe, Coulter." He did not answer, but his fingers briefly curled around hers, a fleeting moment of warmth before he slipped out of the hayloft and melted into the shadows behind the buildings. Mercy walked out into the main street of Dust Hollow. She did not hurry. She did not hide. She walked with her head held high, her steps even and deliberate, directly toward the stark white church. The few people still making their way to the service stopped and stared, their mouths agape. They saw the boyish hair, the men's clothing, and slowly, with dawning, scandalized horror, they recognized her. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass, following her up the stone steps and through the heavy oak doors. Inside, the church was full. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and self-righteousness. Every head turned as she entered. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Her father was at the pulpit, his hands resting on the open Bible, his voice in the middle of a booming sermon about the serpent that lies in wait to tempt the weak. He faltered, his words dying in his throat as he saw her. She walked down the central aisle, the sound of her worn boots echoing in the sudden, profound silence. She did not look at the stunned faces of the people she had known her entire life. Her eyes were fixed on her father. She saw the shock in his face, followed by a flash of disbelief, and then a deep, settling coldness that was far more terrifying than rage. She stopped at the foot of the pulpit, just below the altar where she had been baptized, where she had prayed 1,000 empty prayers. She reached into her shirt and pulled out the small, leather-bound journal. "Good morning, Father," she said, her voice carrying with perfect clarity in the still, silent church. "Mercy," he breathed, his knuckles white where he gripped the pulpit. "What is the meaning of this? What devilry has possessed you?" "No devil," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she had never known she had. "Only the truth." She took 2 more steps and laid the journal on the altar, on top of the Holy Bible. "I believe this belongs to you." The Reverend Blake stared at the book as if it were a coiled snake. "It is all in there, Father," Mercy continued, her voice rising to address the entire congregation. "All of your secret sermons, all of your private tithes, the names of the girls you judged to be disobedient, the prices for which you sold them. Sarah Miller, Elizabeth Finch, Martha Gable. Their names are in your book, your sins, written in your own hand." For a moment, there was only a stunned, disbelieving silence. Then, her father's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at her, his voice a roar of righteous indignation. "Liar," he thundered. "She is a liar, possessed by the wicked man who stole her from her home. She has been defiled. Her mind is poisoned. She speaks with the tongue of a whore." His words broke the spell. The congregation erupted. Some people, particularly the mothers of the girls Mercy had named, stared at the journal on the altar with faces full of dawning horror and doubt. But others, the ones whose loyalty to the preacher was absolute, surged to their feet, their faces twisted with anger. "Shame!" a woman cried. "Blasphemer!" a man shouted. In the back of the church, Sheriff Brody and his 2 deputies, who had been waiting by the door, began to push their way through the chaos. "This has gone far enough," Brody yelled, his hand on his pistol. "This woman is hysterical. She is a danger to the community." Coulter, positioned near the west wall, saw the tide turning. He saw the deputies closing in on Mercy, who stood her ground by the altar, her face pale but resolute. Coulter moved. He kicked over a heavy wooden pew, sending it crashing to the floor with a sound like a thunderclap. The sudden noise created a moment of confusion, a brief opening. "Hayes!" Brody bellowed, finally spotting him. "You are under arrest." Coulter drew his pistol, not to shoot, but to command attention. "Stay back," he ordered. But the church was a tinderbox, and Mercy's accusation had been the match. A rancher loyal to the preacher lunged at Coulter from the side. Coulter sidestepped, bringing the barrel of his pistol down on the man's head. But another was right behind him. The standoff exploded into a brawl. The church, a house of peace, became a swirl of desperate, flailing violence. Through it all, Coulter fought with a cold, economical fury, his only goal to get to Mercy. He saw the deputies reach her. One grabbed her arm, and she drove her elbow into his ribs with a force that surprised him, a move Coulter had taught her. But the other one seized her from behind, pinning her arms. She cried out his name. "Coulter!" He threw a man aside and started toward her, but Sheriff Brody stood in his way, his own pistol now drawn. "It is over. Hayes!" From the corner of his eye, Coulter saw one of the deputies raising his gun. He threw himself to the side, a fraction of a second before a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wood of the pulpit where he had just been standing. He fired back, aiming for the deputy's leg, and the man went down with a cry. But the move had left him exposed. As he turned back toward Brody, a searing, white-hot pain tore through his left side. He grunted, stumbling back, his hand flying to the wound. Blood, hot and slick, immediately soaked his shirt. Through a haze of pain, he saw them dragging Mercy toward a side door. Her eyes, wide with terror, were locked on him. He had to get out. He had to get to her. Ignoring the fire in his side, he lunged for the large stained-glass window behind him, the one depicting a wrathful angel. He used the butt of his pistol to shatter the colored glass and threw himself through the opening, landing in a shower of broken shards on the soft ground of the churchyard outside. He staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding side, and ran for the livery stable, his only thought to get his horse and follow them. The setting sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in violent streaks of orange and crimson. The world for Coulter was a dizzying blur of pain and motion. He rode his buckskin hard, leaning low over the saddle, the rhythmic jarring of the horse's gallop sending waves of agony through him. The blood flowed freely from the wound in his side, and a cold sweat slicked his skin. He knew where they would have taken her, the old, abandoned barn at the edge of the Miller property. It was isolated, a place where screams would go unheard, a place fit for the dark work of purification. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of old hay, dust, and decay. Beams of red-gold light from the setting sun slanted through the gaps in the warped wooden walls, illuminating floating motes of dust. Mercy was tied to a thick central support beam, the rough rope digging into her wrists. Her cheek was bruised from where one of the deputies had struck her, but her eyes were dry and unbroken. Sheriff Brody stood before her, his face flushed, his breathing heavy. His pretense of civility was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly sneer. "You see what you have done?" he said, gesturing vaguely back toward the town. "You have brought chaos to a peaceful, God-fearing community. Your father is a holy man, and you are nothing but a snake."
"My father is a monster and a hypocrite,"
Mercy said, her voice shaking but clear.
"And you are his dog."
The sheriff's face darkened. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You had to be the special one, did not you? Too good for this town, too good for the decent men who wanted you. Well, you are not so special now. You are just a filthy little sinner." and you are going to be cleansed." He reached out and traced a dirty finger along her jawline. She recoiled, straining against the ropes, her heart pounding with a cold, sickening dread. But the fear did not silence her. It fueled her. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze filled not with terror, but with a sudden, profound understanding.
"You do not hate me because I am a sinner,"
she said, her voice low and steady. "You hate what you can't control." His face contorted with rage. Her words had struck a nerve, exposing the pathetic truth behind his blustering authority. He raised his hand, his knuckles white, ready to strike her, to beat her into the submission he so desperately craved. The barn door creaked open. Coulter stood there, silhouetted against the burning sunset. He was a terrifying sight, pale as a ghost, his shirt soaked in blood, his face a mask of agony and unwavering purpose. He held his pistol in a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of standing. Sheriff Brody spun around, his eyes wide with shock. "Hayes, I should have known you were too stubborn to die." He drew his own pistol, a sneer returning to his face. "Looks like your luck has finally run out." Coulter did not speak. He took a stumbling step into the barn, his boots crunching on the dry, scattered straw. He raised his gun. The two men stood facing each other for a silent, frozen moment. The sheriff, a man who represented a corrupt and rotten law, and Coulter, a man who lived by his own broken code of justice. Brody fired first. The shot was wild, born of surprise and anger, and it splintered the wooden beam just inches from Mercy's head. Coulter's shot was not wild. It was slow, deliberate, and true. The sound of it was deafening in the enclosed space. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of Sheriff Brody's chest. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then back at Coulter. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but only a choked gurgle emerged. Then he crumpled to the ground and was still. The echo of the gunshot faded, leaving a ringing silence. For a moment, the only sound was Mercy's ragged breathing. Then, Coulter's strength finally gave out. His pistol slipped from his nerveless fingers. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, a heap of blood and exhaustion, just a few feet from the man he had just killed. Mercy screamed his name, struggling uselessly against the ropes. It could not end like this, not after everything. Just then, she heard the frantic drumming of hoofbeats, the sound of horses ridden hard, coming to a stop outside. The barn door, which had swung partially shut, was thrown open again. Silhouetted against the last, dying light of the day stood Clara, and beside her, a tall, grim-faced man with a silver star pinned to his vest. They stood frozen on the threshold for a second, their eyes taking in the horrific tableau within. The dead sheriff, the wounded hero, and the preacher's daughter, tied to a beam but alive, bruised but finally, terribly, free. The world returned to Coulter in fragments. First, there was pain, a deep, throbbing fire in his side that seemed to have its own heartbeat. Then came sounds, hushed and distorted, the clink of metal against ceramic, the rustle of cloth. For what felt like an eternity, he floated in a gray twilight of fever dreams, haunted by the ghost of his sister's cry and the deafening echo of his own gunshot. Through it all, one thing was a constant, an anchor in the swirling darkness, a voice, soft and steady, whispering his name. When he finally opened his eyes and the world swam into focus, he saw her. Mercy was sitting in a chair beside his bed, her face pale and tired in the lamplight, her short-cropped hair framing eyes that looked as if they had not slept in days. They were not in the filthy barn or his small, rented room. They were in Doc Miller's clean, spare cabin, and the air smelled of carbolic acid and lavender. "You're awake?" she said, her voice catching with relief. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. She seemed to understand, and immediately held a cup with a spoonful of water to his lips. It was a slow, agonizing process. He was weaker than a newborn kitten, every breath a battle. Doc Miller had told her he had lost a dangerous amount of blood, and that the fever from the infection had nearly claimed him. He had survived, but just barely. The weeks that followed were a long, slow climb back to the living. Mercy never left his side. She changed his bandages, her touch gentle and sure. She spoon-fed him broth, coaxing him to eat when he had no strength or will to do so. She read to him from a worn copy of a novel she had found, her voice a soothing balm against the long, painful hours. She was no longer the fragile girl he had met in the general store. In the crucible of the last few weeks, she had been forged into something new, something with the tensile strength of tempered steel. She became his guardian in more ways than one. Dust Hollow was a town in turmoil, ripped apart by the revelations from the church. The federal marshal, Elias Thorne, had taken control, his presence a grim promise that the old ways were over. But the poison of the Reverend Blake's teachings ran deep. There were still those in the town who saw Coulter as a villain, a gunslinging drifter who had brought chaos and death to their door. They saw Mercy as a fallen woman, a Jezebel who had betrayed her own father. One afternoon, a burly rancher named Jedediah Stone, a man who had always been one of her father's most fervent supporters, appeared at the door of the doc's cabin. "We want him out," Stone said, his voice a low growl, his eyes fixed on Coulter, who was propped up on a pillow, pale and gaunt. "He has brought nothing but trouble here." Mercy stepped between the man and the bed, her small frame a surprisingly solid barrier.
"He is not well enough to travel,"
she said, her voice cold and even. "That is not my concern," Stone sneered. "He is a killer, and you should be ashamed, turning on your own kin."
"My only shame,"
Mercy replied, her eyes flashing, "is that I did not see the truth sooner. Mr. Hayes saved my life. He saved the lives of other girls your holy man sold like cattle. Now, I am asking you to leave." The rancher took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. "You think you can order me around, girl?"
"I am not ordering you,"
she said, and her hand moved to rest on the handle of the Bowie knife that now sat on the small table by Coulter's bed. She did not draw it. She did not have to. The message was clear. Her eyes, unwavering and fearless, told him she would use it. The rancher stared at her for a long, shocked moment, seeing not the timid preacher's daughter, but a woman he did not recognize, a woman who would not be moved. He grumbled a curse under his breath, turned, and left. Coulter had watched the entire exchange, a strange mix of pride and a deeper, more familiar ache filling his chest. She did not need him to protect her anymore. She had found her own strength. The official reckoning came on a cold, gray morning a week later. Marshal Thorne, armed with Clara's testimony and the damning evidence of the journal, formally arrested the Reverend Thaddeus Blake. They took him from the parsonage, his hands bound in chains. He did not shout or preach. His fall was silent and bitter. As he was led past the doc's cabin, his eyes met Mercy's. She stood on the small porch, watching. He looked at her not with remorse or even sadness, but with a look of cold, profound hatred. It was the look of a tyrant who had been toppled, blaming not his own corruption, but the one subject who had dared to defy him. Mercy held his gaze, her heart aching with the ghost of the father she had once loved. But she did not flinch. She watched until he was gone, a final, silent severing of the chains that had bound her for a lifetime. With the town under federal investigation and the worst of the corruption cut out, a fragile sense of hope began to take root in Dust Hollow. The real change, however, was not led by the lawmen, but by the women. Clara, with a small fund provided by the marshal, took over the abandoned saloon, but instead of whiskey and cards, she filled it with clean beds, warm blankets, and hot food. It became a sanctuary, a safe place for the women who had been freed from the trafficking ring and the other outcasts of the town. Mercy was there every day, her sleeves rolled up. Working alongside Clara, she taught some of the younger girls to read, using the very Bible her father had once used as a weapon. She listened to their stories. She held their hands, and she helped them believe in a future that was not defined by their past. She had refused to leave Dust Hollow, not because it was the only home she had ever known, but because she was determined to make it a home worth having. "We cannot let them be the only story this town tells," she had explained to Clara. "We have to build something better on the ashes." As Mercy found her purpose, Coulter found himself adrift. His body was healing, the wound in his side closing into another scar on a body already mapped with them. He was able to walk now, first with a limp, then with his old, familiar stride. But as his physical strength returned, the ghosts he had held at bay came rushing back in. The fight was over. The girl was safe. His vow, in this one instance, was fulfilled, and he did not know what to do with the quiet. He watched her from a distance, saw the way she laughed with Clara, the gentle way she helped a young girl sound out a difficult word. She was building a life, a community. She belonged here. He, on the other hand, was a creature of the shadows, a man shaped by violence and loss. He knew how to track and how to fight, how to survive in the dark, empty places. He did not know how to stay. He did not know how to live in the light. The belief that he was too broken for this kind of peace settled in his bones. Cold and heavy as a stone, he was a storm, and a man like him did not deserve the shelter of a quiet harbor. He would only end up destroying it. His scars, the ones on his skin and the deeper ones on his soul, were too heavy to lay down beside someone. He had let her in, let himself feel something other than guilt and rage, and it had nearly gotten them both killed. It was a mistake he could not afford to make again. He made his decision in the dead of night, the way he made all his decisions. Alone, he gathered his few belongings, saddled his buckskin, and prepared to ride out, to disappear back into the wilderness where he belonged. He would leave without a word, a ghost slipping away in the darkness. It was kinder that way, a cleaner break. He was leading his horse out of the livery when he saw her. She was standing in the middle of the street, a silhouette against the first pale hint of dawn. A light snow had begun to fall, the flakes dusting her short hair and her shoulders. She was barefoot in the cold, wearing only a simple nightgown, as if she had run from her bed the moment she sensed he was leaving. He stopped, his heart giving a painful lurch. She walked toward him, her bare feet making no sound on the thin layer of snow. She stopped a few feet away, her breath misting in the frigid air. "You were not going to say goodbye," she said. It was not an accusation, but a simple, sad statement of fact. "It is better this way," he said, his voice rough. "I do not belong here. Mercy." "So you will just ride away?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a sorrow that cut him to the bone. "Back to the hunting, back to the fighting. Is that all there is for you?" "It is who I am," he said, the words tasting like a lie even as he said them. "No," she said, taking another step closer. "That is what you do. It is not who you are." She looked at him, her blue eyes searching his, pleading with him to see what she saw. "You saved me, Coulter. You walked through fire for me. For girls you did not even know. You saved me from my father. You saved me from this town. You even saved me from myself." She was so close now he could feel the warmth of her breath. "Now, let me save you." Her words shattered the last of his defenses. The lonely, grieving boy he kept locked away inside him finally broke free. A raw, broken sound escaped his throat. "And what if I ruin it all?" he asked, his voice cracking. The question a confession of his deepest, darkest fear. "What if I bring my ghosts here? What if I am too heavy, too broken? What if I destroy everything you are building?" She looked at him, and the smile that touched her lips was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing he had ever seen. She reached up and laid her hand against his cheek, her palm warm against his cold skin. "Then ruin it with me." Her words were an absolution, a promise not of a perfect life, but of a shared one. He looked down at her, at this impossible, courageous woman who was offering him a home not in a place, but in herself. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not like their first kiss in the mountains, born of fire and desperation. This was quiet and slow. The snow fell around them, blanketing the scarred, ugly town in a layer of clean, white peace. There was no heat in the kiss, no passion, just a long, slow breath of belonging. It was the feeling of a man who had been wandering in the wilderness for a lifetime, finally, impossibly, finding his way home. The seasons turned, washing the scars from the land and the town. The harsh winter gave way to a muddy, hopeful spring, which in turn bloomed into a summer of long, golden days. The name Dust Hollow remained, but it was no longer a fitting description. With the Reverend Blake and his cronies gone, a quiet but profound change had taken root. The oppressive silence that had once blanketed the streets was the first thing to break. It was replaced by the rhythmic sound of hammers as new homes were built and old ones repaired. New families, hearing of cheap, fertile land and a town scrubbing itself clean of its past, began to arrive. They came in dusty wagons, their faces wary at first, but soon their children's laughter became a sound as common as the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. Dust Hollow was no longer a town of silence. The women, in particular, had found their voices. They gathered at the well not to whisper in fearful huddles, but to talk openly, their voices carrying on the breeze. They spoke of planting gardens, of the price of flour at Henderson's store, of their children's futures. They no longer moved with their heads bowed, their shoulders hunched against an expected blow. They walked with a newfound purpose, their eyes clear and direct. The thick cloak of righteousness that had once smothered the town had been thrown off, and, in its place, a fragile but resilient community was beginning to grow. At the heart of this transformation was Mercy Blake. She was no longer the preacher's daughter. That girl, with her severe bun and downcast eyes, had died in the mountains and been buried in the snow. The woman who had taken her place was someone the town had never seen before. Her hair, which she kept cut short in that same ragged, boyish style, was often tousled by the wind. She wore practical skirts and sturdy boots, and her face, once so pale and serious, was now dusted with freckles from hours spent in the sun. She had a smile that was quick and genuine, but her eyes held a wisdom far beyond her years, the quiet gravity of someone who had faced the wolf at her door and had not backed down. She and Clara had turned the old church, the site of so much fear and judgment, into a schoolhouse. The pews where people had once trembled under her father's fiery sermons were now filled with the town's children, and a growing number of its women, all eager to learn. Mercy was their teacher. In the mornings, she would stand at the front of the room, a piece of chalk in her hand, and guide them through the mysteries of the alphabet and the magic of numbers. Her voice, once a timid whisper, was now clear and confident. She taught them to read from dime novels and poetry books, teaching them that words could be used not just to condemn, but to build worlds. But her lessons did not end with reading and writing. In the afternoons, she would take a small group of the older girls and young women out to the fields beyond the town, there, leaning against the warm wood of a newly built fence. She taught them another kind of lesson. She would bring out a pair of small, well-cared-for rifles, and she would teach them how to shoot. "Knowledge is your first defense," she would tell them, her voice serious as she showed them how to load a cartridge. "It gives you the power to question, to understand the world for yourselves. But sometimes, knowledge is not enough." She would then guide their hands, showing them how to aim, how to control their breathing, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. "This," she would say, the sharp crack of the rifle shot echoing across the plains, "is your last defense It is the power to say no and to make it stick. I pray you never have to use it, but you will never again be in a position where you cannot. She was giving them the tools for a freedom she had been forced to seize for herself, the freedom of the mind and the freedom of the body. She was no longer just Mercy. She was something wilder, freer, a testament to the fact that a woman's strength was not found in her purity, but in her refusal to be broken. Coulter Hayes watched this new world take shape with a sense of profound, dislocating wonder. He had stayed. The decision, made in the snow before dawn, was one he had to remake every single day. He had spent his entire adult life as a ghost, a drifter defined by motion and violence. The stillness of this new life was a foreign country, and he was an awkward, uncertain immigrant. He threw himself into the physical work of rebuilding the town, as if he could construct a new identity for himself with his own two hands. He helped the new families raise the frames of their cabins. His hands, so accustomed to the cold steel of a gun, learned the heft and balance of a hammer, the bite of a saw against fresh pine. He worked from sunup to sundown, the sweat and exhaustion a welcome anesthetic for the restlessness that still churned within him. He helped build the sturdy fences that now marked the town's boundaries, a strange irony for a man who had never known any. And he helped build the schoolhouse, his work slow and meticulous, as if the very act of building a place of hope could somehow atone for the failures of his past. The townspeople, at first wary of the grim, quiet man who had killed their sheriff, slowly began to accept him. They saw the solid way he built, the gentle way he treated the horses, the silent, watchful protection he offered Mercy. They learned to read the quiet language of his presence. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep and unwavering loyalty. But the past was not a ghost that could be banished by hard work. Though he slept in a warm bed beside Mercy every night, he never slept soundly. The slightest sound, a coyote's cry in the distance, the creak of a floorboard, would have him instantly awake, his hand reaching for the pistol that was no longer kept under his pillow. He had forced himself to put it away in a locked box, a conscious, daily act of faith in a peace he did not fully trust. He still watched the hills, every evening. As the sun began to set, he would find himself standing on the porch of the small cabin he and Mercy now shared, his eyes scanning the distant, rolling horizon. He was watching for threats that no longer existed, his body still coiled for a fight that was long over. The instincts that had kept him alive for so long were now a prison. He was a wolf who had been taught to live among sheep, and he was terrified that one day his true nature would reemerge and devour everything he had come to love. Mercy understood this. She never pushed him to talk about the shadows in his eyes. She simply stood with him, her presence a quiet, unwavering statement that he was not alone in his vigil. One clear, cold autumn evening, she found him there, in his usual spot on the porch. The day's work was done. A stew simmered on the stove inside, filling the air with a scent of home. He was staring up at the night sky, which was a vast, dark blanket pricked with 1,000 glittering stars. He seemed a world away, lost in the silent, empty spaces he had once called home. She came up behind him without a word and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against the solid muscle of his back. He did not startle. He had learned the sound of her footsteps, the feel of her presence, and it was the one thing that did not set his teeth on edge. He relaxed into her hold, his hands coming up to cover hers. They stood like that for a long time, watching the stars. Two quiet souls who had found their anchor in each other. He was still the man who watched the hills, and she was still the woman who carried the memory of a locked cellar in her heart. Their scars had not vanished, but they had learned to live with them, to see them not as signs of brokenness, but as proof that they had survived. Mercy tilted her head back, her short hair brushing against his shoulder. A slow, playful smile touched her lips. She leaned in close, her voice a warm, soft whisper against his ear, a callback to a desperate, stormy night that felt like a lifetime ago. I still don't want to be a good girl tonight. He froze for a second, the words hanging in the crisp night air. And then, a sound that was still rare enough to be startling filled the quiet space. A laugh. It started as a low rumble in his chest and grew into a sound of pure, unburdened freedom. It was the sound of a man finally letting go of the ghosts, of a soul finally coming home to roost. He turned in her arms, his own smile mirroring hers, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling with a joy she had worked so hard to give him. He looked down at her, at the incredible, strong, wild woman who had saved him from himself, and his heart felt so full he thought it might burst. Without a word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She gave a small, happy gasp, her arms circling his neck. He carried her across the threshold, into the warm, firelit cabin. But this time, he did not shut the door behind them, sealing them away from the world. He left it wide open to the vast, starry night, to the quiet promise of their shared future, the story of Dust Hollow, and of the two broken souls who had rebuilt it, and each other, was no longer one of darkness and secrets, but a quiet, enduring hymn of hope and healing. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.